Jahanara Khan glided through the airlock of the pale blue dot, flashing a cursory glance at the biometric scanner as she went. A small, comforting click from the doors behind, coming as something of a relief. It meant that her biometrics had, by some cosmic grace, yet to be blacklisted, which in turn meant that she had been granted entry to the station, just like any other galactic punter would, and would not therefore be exiting as swiftly as she'd arrived, via the depressurized suction of bleakest outer space. Hoping that the bioscanners were no longer watching, Jahanara flicked her tongue up across a choir of shimmering eyes, licking them clean of her light-refracting tears. These tears were the innate defense mechanism of her species. To potential predators, 100 blinding orbs of brightest sunlight roaring in the darkness must have been dreadfully off-putting indeed, but boy if they didn't make it hard for Jahanara to see by. As the lobby doors crunked open ahead of her, briefly she thought of her fathers, remembered watching them, copycatting them as they licked their own eyes clean, defense mechanism on defense mechanism. She smiled. Or, at least, she made a series of quiet, affectionate clicking noises, which is good as past for a smile, in a species who creation had deigned to place outside the need for a jaw. As Jahanara Khan hovered beneath the neon lights of the pale blue dot's reception area, momentarily overcome by a wave of nostalgia, back on the landing pad outside, a small green blob trudged wearily up the gangplank of Khan's spaceship. The small green blob was the station's resident parking valet. It had been the resident parking valet for the best part of 4.6 million years, and recently it was beginning to grow rather tired of its duty. Manoeuvring Khan's chrome, comet-shaped ship into a free spot in the pale blue dot's gravitational orbit, the small green blob, lost in dreamy, aspirational thoughts of piloting more upmarket models into the orbit of some classier, more galactically central space station, failed to notice the approach of a quietly purring troop carrier. It had failed to notice the troop carrier when, minutes earlier, it had pulled a sharp U-turn around a hurtling asteroid as soon as Jahanara Khan had sped into its viewfinder. The small green blob had failed to notice the carrier turn from dull, unadorned grey to near invisible as it engaged its camouflage protocol, a billion microscopic lenses on the surface of its hulk turning outward to face the stars, mirroring the vast black and white canvas of space. With a sigh which sounded like a tub of wet putty being rudely fingered, the small green blob left Jahanara's ship in orbit, and as it fell with a soft splat back to the landing pad of the pale blue dot, it failed to notice the camouflaged troop carrier parking itself quite illegally next to Khan's vehicle. Of course, having said that, I'm not so sure that even if the small green blob had noticed, it would have given much of a damn. As I've said, it was getting rather tired of the whole routine, and short of drafting its letter of resignation, the infiltration of the station by a gang of camouflaged guns for hire, happening on the small green blob's watch, might just have proved the fireable offence it was otherwise too good-natured to commit. Back in its office, the small green blob tuned back into the ether waves, only to discover it had missed the play of the millennium, and the Martian rocket thrusters were up on the Biffinesian Blorgons by 12 over pi. The blob swore grotesquely, and decided it would have flung Khan's keys at the wave emitter, exploding the both of them in myriad fragments, if only its species had ever evolved to have arms. The interior of the pale blue dot had not changed a single bit since last Jahanara had indulged in its once popular, now embarrassingly gauche flavour of hospitality. The station, moored in a sorry corner of the Milky Way by some freak accident of gravitational science, was named for the view one could enjoy from its observational deck. Namely, that remote and infinitesimally small speck of blue matter hanging in nothingness, which was at one point in its history known as something like Earth. Yes, Earth, that's it. The pale blue dot was moored at more or less the exact point in space at which the Voyager 1 space probe had been commanded by its overlords to turn and photograph planet Earth before it left the cosmos, back in the Earth year 1990. Arguably one of the more obscure selfies of humanity's digital age. The photograph, in which the size of Earth was barely that of a single pixel, had been rather dramatically entitled The Pale Blue Dot. Many, many years later, when the last refugees from Earth once more travelled the ancient route of their Voyager probe, they built this space station to act as a waypoint for future travellers. And for a time, the pale blue dot had attracted a good deal of custom, despite being so out of the way. Seemingly, the curiosity which the possibility of viewing an abandoned planet invoked had been more than enough to fill the coffers of the space station's owners. As a result, they had grown altogether too comfortable, neglecting to update the station's furnishings, not bothering to refresh the place with trendier lighting or a dash of paint, leaving the hologram hostesses to slowly judder into a lagging, distorted presentational loop. Even the roster of staff, including folks such as our poor and inobservant friend, the small green blob, had not once been updated. The bartenders were the same teeth-grindingly upbeat AIs that they had always been. And once the novelty of spying Earth from this cold and lonely pinprick of the theoretical multiverse had worn off, once even the term human or Homo sapiens sapien had been resigned to the history podcasts, the owners of the pale blue dot had found themselves quite suddenly out of pocket, with no dosh to update the place whether they'd suddenly found the urge to or not. At the mercy of some of the galaxy's most blood-hungry loan sharks, most of whom were literal sharks from the aquamoon of Androgyny 4, the owners had just upped and vanished one day. Since then, the station had been kept running in a state of semi-competent operation by a miscellaneous band of misfits and nomadic wanderers, for however long each of them happened to make the place their home. Them, and, of course, those long-suffering, holographic, artificially intelligent and small, green, blobbish beings who comprised the original staff list. Thus, nowadays, the pale blue dot was known not for its eponymous scenery, but as a hovel of depravity, hedonism, and criminality, the likes of which could even have turned the stomachs of the Andromedan gastrophiles, who were, both literally and metaphorically, walking stomachs. It was not the sort of place one sought out if one was looking for legitimate work, friendship, learning, or, in fact, even a comfortable place to rest and recuperate. And yet, it was exactly the place Jahanara Khan had in mind when setting her ship's autopilot. And for one reason, and one reason only, the pale blue dot was an excellent place to hide. Bartender! Excuse me! Bartender! The lounge of the pale blue dot was that evening playing host to the musical atrocities of a narco-punk outfit, the Legionnaires of Sin, a ragtag group of alien life forms with an ever-revolving lineup. Their whole shtick was that their music was written to be accessible to all. Commendable in theory, but in practice rarely practical. Presently, the band, constituting a singing cloud of stardust, a tripletoid of bass-emitting chrysanthemums, and a living, breathing Fender Stratocaster, were thrashing out a song from their 50-second EP called 11010001110110. Most of the bar's current patrons wore earplugs and paid the band little attention. Toward the front of the stage, however, a small, devoted group of supercomputers were screaming their bloody lungs out. As Jahanara tried and failed once more to attract the attention of the AI bartender, she saw that he too was enraptured by this particular track. Presently, the Legionnaires of Sin concluded their song in a fit of ones and zeros, before retiring through the curtain at the back of the stage for a much applauded break. Jahanara yelled along the grimy expanse of bar, and this time the bartender turned to her, raised a finger in recognition, and wheeled himself along to face her. "Hiya," she chirped, the insectoid beeps and buzzes of her language taking longer than usual to register in the vox box of the robotic drinks dispenser.
"Well, howdy-do, miss. Seems you're new around these parts. I do declare. you'll be wanting for a
Drink, aye, interrupted Jahanara, gradually remembering why it was it had been so long since her last visit to the pale blue dot. Earthlings and their bloody sentimentality, she thought. What would they think, she wondered, to know the last native speaker of their language is this gravity-forsaken robot? Give me... She looked over the shoulder of the bartender, at the tall cabinet of mostly antiquated earthling spirits, none of which she supposed tasted anything like their ancestors. Give me a Jim and Frolic, would you? Make it a double.
A mighty fine choice, miss. And a double, you say? Woo-wee! Aiming to shake the dust from your boots, I'd wager.
Something like that, Jahanara grumbled.
Coming right up.
She rolled several of her 100 eyes.
And how would the kind miss like to pay today?
Asked the jolly robot, plonking a glass of murky liquid in front of her. Wordlessly, Jahanara unzipped her bum bag, and from some large object inside broke a tiny piece. In response to the bartender's question, she slid across the bar something quite indescribably beautiful. Almost metallic, the little fragment glittered with the radiance of 1,000 stars. Its edges were confusingly improbable, the measurements of its matter implausible, and impossible to fully quantify with the naked eye, no matter whether you had 1 or 100 of them. The robot across from her had gone perfectly silent, and Jahanara felt she could almost see the gears turning inside its ancient frame. She pushed the wee glittery thing further across the bar, a nervous trilling at the back of her throat, sign of her impatience. At long last, something in the AI barkeep seemed to click. Clanging open an antique replica cash register, he exclaimed loudly,
"Hey-haw! There's gold in them there!"
But before he could finish, he was silenced with a sharp slap from the sticky, foot-long tongue of Jahanara Khan. Keep your damn fool mouth shut, cowboy, and there's more where that came from. Comprende? Of course, Khan didn't actually say these words. In her language, there was no concept of bovines, let alone bovine boys, and Spanish was the name of a modestly sized asteroid mining enterprise, not a language. Thankfully for her, though, whatever it was she did say, when translated via the robot bartender's outdated voxbox, made perfect colloquial sense to him. Accordingly, he shut his damn fool mouth. Jahanara clicked her appreciation and immediately set about the interesting task of supping her Jim and Frolic from the human-designed highball glass. The drink tasted only mildly rank, a whiff of something vaguely floral masking the worst of its flavour. As the Legionnaires of Sin returned centre stage for Act 9 of the night, now with a lineup solely comprised of floating mollusks, Khan sank her second double-strength beverage and ordered both a third and a fourth. She sensed the arrival of the sentient orb a fraction of a second before it spoke.
Captain Khan of the frequently inebriated. I dare say I never thought I'd see you again. What is it brings you here this time, business or business?
The last time Jahanara Khan had seen Glorfindel, the extraneously conscious light orb, the pair had been cresting the swell of a particularly nasty come-down the morning after the night before. And the night before the last time Jahanara had seen Glorfindel, the extraneously conscious light orb, she'd watched them vaporise half an ounce of black market thrushweed, snort several grams of high-grade Saturnalian moondust, and still have the composure to seduce a literal herd of scorpion people into bed. The pair had been celebrating, she remembered, the equitable brokering of peace between the planet Ouch, home to the scorpion people, and its moon, Hearth. Glorfindel had been hired by Hearth to infiltrate the inner circle of the scorpion people's high command, whilst Jahanara had signed a contract with the Scorpios of Ouch, who had asked her in no uncertain terms to blow up their moon. Long story short, after a brief and uninteresting squabble, Glorfindel and Jahanara had come to a rather more peaceful solution. It had turned out, you see, that the Scorpion people of Ouch only wanted their moon destroyed because they believed that the immense shadow it cast over their world was depriving them of their inherent right to sunlight. The moon called Hearth, which was itself a conscious entity, had only hired Glorfindel out of panicked self-defense. Jahanara, sensing that the Scorpion people of Ouch were perhaps misguided in their desire for sunlight, simply had Glorfindel ask Hearth the moon to move over a little bit and let some sunlight fall on Ouch for a little while. As she had suspected, exposed to the intense heat of their star, the Scorpion people of Ouch very quickly realised their mistake, saw that, in fact, they rather enjoyed the cold, the shade, the permanence of night which had, funnily enough, governed their evolution in the first place. The moon, realigning herself once more, had been extremely grateful to both Glorfindel and Jahanara for not blowing her up, whilst the Scorpion people of Ouch had been grateful, despite their bruised egos, for having learned their lesson and for still having a moon in the shadow of which they could thrive. Jahanara's rapidly unravelling train of thought was interrupted by the floating orb once again.
Come here often then.
"He better not be trying a bloody line on me," thought Jahanara. "I'm no Scorpio, and I haven't got the bloody time anyway."
I was only asking,
said Glorfindel, the swirling colours inside their sphere turning an offended shade of orange.
And by the way,
they added,
I'd prefer she. I'm in my feminine cycle right now. Thank you very much for noticing.
Jahanara, slurping into her fourth drink of the hour, was stunned. She turned to Glorfindel with her tongue still stuck at the bottom of her glass. How did you just...
Read your thoughts.
Eh? Oh, God, aye. I'd forgotten. Realisation settled in Jahanara's mind as naturally as the dust on her wings. How could she have forgotten? Glorfindel was one of a small, endangered species of extraneously conscious light orbs, who were not so much mind readers as mind readers. The conscious thoughts of all life forms, in other words, were as visible to Glorfindel's species as the various furnishings of the pale blue dot's bar were to Jahanara. More so, in fact, for by now the double gym and frolics were beginning to catch up with her, and everything in the room had developed a sort of fuzzy quality. Glorfindel didn't have to try and read her mind, they only had to look at her whilst she thought.
Buy you a drink?
Offered the orb.
Looks like you could use one.
Sure.
Bartender.
Yee-haw! What can I do you for, ma'am?
Jahanara winced. And so it was, to the sound of the Legionnaires of Sin thrashing their instruments alongside a solemn reading of Carla Barks's Canine Manifesto, that two old freelancers got themselves right and royally reacquainted. Out with their earshot, back on the crumbling landing pad of the pale blue dot, in the cramped and rarely tidied office of its resident parking valet, 2 shots were fired. The first passed through a soft, green and squishy mass of tissue as if it were jelly, the sheer heat of the quasar blaster's antimatter ammo instantly frying the splattered remains of the small green blob. The blob's roasting gizzards smelled quite a bit like garlic, and the assassin couldn't help but salivate. The second shot, fired several seconds later, blew the small green blob's wave emitter to smithereens. The commentator, you see, had just announced that the Biffinesian Blorgons had struck back, overtaking the Martian rocket thrusters at the final honk, and securing themselves for the 7th century running the coveted Plutonium Cup. Aside from a sorry mess of death and destruction, all that the assassin left behind in that small valley cubicle were the torn remains of her betting slip. Closer inspection showed that the Biffinesian game was the last in a long accumulator of games which the assassin had been correctly predicting. The Blorgon's win had cost her a pretty penny. 2, to be exact.